Hi everyone and welcome back to Watchmaker. Nick here with another episode, and today we're talking about the topic I have probably come across the most and one that I get asked quite often. Because people often ask if they should choose a watch with a third-party movement. And sometimes they almost feel guilty for even asking, but the interesting thing is there was a time when this didn't matter at all, but somehow it became a big deal, even though most don't really even know why. Because what truly matters is not whether it is an in-house or not, but whether it offers real benefits in the four key elements like innovation, quality, exclusivity, or fair pricing. But before we get into that, let's first see where this whole hype even started. When we look back, there was a time when having watches equipped with third-party movements was completely normal, and even some of the biggest brands used them. For instance, Patek Philippe used the Lemania, Rolex the Zenith El Primero, and Omega relied at some point on ETA movements before transitioning to fully in-house calibres. The interesting thing is that back then using movements like Lemania was seen as a kind of warranty or quality stamp, known for its reliability. But why did this approach suddenly change? Now, before the quartz crisis, a mechanical watch was primarily an instrument to tell time, but after the crisis, mechanical watches lost this main function. So brands had to find a way to make them appealing as mechanical, advanced luxury gadgets. So from that point on, brands needed new selling points to stand out. Because telling time alone no longer mattered, because people started buying mechanical watches for the experience and as a symbol of status. This is when brands started looking for new ways to stand out, and the movement was the most obvious area, not just in design but in function and quality. So they began adding real upgrades like better reliability, longer service intervals, and features that actually mattered to the wearer. So unsurprisingly, people began associating the term in-house movement with better quality, exclusivity, price justification, and innovation, and often had this romantic picture in their head of a brand manufacturing everything within their walls. And once brands saw how much people valued the idea of an in-house movement, many started making them mainly for perception, even when the movements, to be honest, offered no real benefits and were still produced by external suppliers. Eventually, this trend escalated when ETA was acquired by the Swatch Group and stopped supplying movements to brands outside the group. And at that point, many brands realized they needed to find a way to overcome this obstacle, which led to a growing focus on developing in-house movements. And to be honest, not necessarily to make things better, but mainly to gain independence and position their brand differently. Today, in-house movements are everywhere, so much that the term has almost lost its meaning because many of them lack the very qualities that once made true in-house calibres special and more appealing than third-party ones. And one of these key elements is innovation, which is often missing, and the first one I would like to highlight. Now, there was a time when making in-house movements was truly driven by innovation, and if you look up what the synonym for innovation is, we find words like advancement, development, improvement, or progress, just to name a few. But the truth is, many of today's in-house movements do not live up to those synonyms because they are quite literally just another movement, one that is not any different from third-party ones, even if it looks different. Because the reality is most of these so-called in-house movements offer no real improvements or innovation. Nothing that makes them functionally better than, for example, an ETA or Celita, and often the difference is where certain components are placed and arranged, but the way those components work remains exactly the same as in third-party movements. And look, the thing is, you can't reinvent the wheel, and what I mean by that is the core principles of a mechanical movement can be changed, only refined, so rearranging sections for the sake of it offers usually zero benefits. But even if there are any benefits at all, mostly these are improvements that are often pointless, such as a slightly higher accuracy on paper, a fraction of a millimeter slimmer, a ridiculous longer power reserve that nobody actually needs, a bit more decoration, and are the things some brands often highlight to justify a higher price, but in reality, they make almost no difference for the wearer. And on top of that, when we consider that many of these in-house movements are actually far less reliable compared to third-party ones, cost more to service, and can be maintained everywhere because the access to spare parts is often restricted to official retailers only. So do in-house movements even make sense? And yes, of course, but only when they deliver something meaningful, like movements such as Rolex new calibre 7135 with its countless useful improvements, Omega's unique coaxial movement, or Grand Seiko spring drive, just to name a few. Because these are movements that bring real innovation, tangible benefits, and performance advantages beyond what most third-party ones can offer. But the ironic part is that many so-called in-house movements with only minor tweaks cost almost as much as genuinely advanced ones, even though they offer no real improvements over standard third-party ones. And often this is simply because they are marked as exclusive, but once we define what exclusive really means, we'll see that even this claim does not hold true when it comes to the most in-house movements, and here is why. So being exclusive basically means something is rare, distinctive, unique, or different, and the thing is, you can become exclusive really quickly if you only consider these synonyms. What I mean is, for instance, if I change the way bridges are cut, is that already enough to call myself exclusive? And yes, this approach might make the movement different, but if this is all it takes to call yourself exclusive, then the watch industry is in real trouble. And you know, this has been quite a common approach in the world of movements, where a brand takes a third-party movement as inspiration, creates literally the same thing just with other dimension and maybe some decoration on top of it. But it doesn't stop there. These movements are, as we know today, manufactured and designed by third-party movement manufacturers. And the really crazy thing is, this is not just the case for entry-level watches. It even goes for some of the most hype brands, such as Richard Mille or Audemars Piguet, where some of the movements are manufactured by Watchmaker. And the funny thing is, even ETA does this now and manufactured the movement exclusively for Longines. And I remember when Longines told us about this, I could not take it seriously, but then I had to remember, wait a second, what they do is exactly what big brands also do. But somehow it seems to be justified as long as it is a fancy sounding movement manufacturer. Of course, some of you will say, yes, but Watchmaker can be compared to ETA or Sellita, which is true, and I absolutely do agree that Watchmaker is a different level. But that's not the point, because now we're talking about exclusivity. And in my opinion, exclusivity is not the case if you pay someone to do something for you that they also do for others, regardless if you designed it from scratch. I mean, just because my movement only exists within my watches and looks different does not make it exclusive in my opinion. And you know, paying a supplier to create something only for you is also not a big deal, even though some brands market it as a breakthrough. Because in my opinion, exclusivity is when the thing itself is rare, unique, and can be found elsewhere. It's not about hiring someone to do it for you or making minor visual tweaks. True exclusivity comes from the effort, the knowledge, and the craftsmanship that only your team can provide as independents. And the good example I already mentioned are Rolex, Omega, or even Zenith with their El Primero movements. And yes, they might not do literally everything in-house, such as the balance spring or certain smaller components. But to be honest, I can live with that, since these movements are created mainly by them, for them, and that for me is the definition of exclusive. This goes, of course, even further, as there are hardcore brands such as Bove or Greubel Forsey, which do more than 90% in-house, including the balance spring. And yes, of course, here we're talking about a completely different price range, but this just gives us an example of how far exclusivity can go and what the benchmark can be when we talk about truly exclusive movements. Now, if innovation and exclusivity aren't always delivered by in-house movements, at least the quality should be better than a third-party movement, right? I mean, at least this is what many buyers still believe, that third-party movements are of a lesser quality. But to be honest, that's far from the truth, and here's why this is not always the case. Now, this has always baffled me, the fact that some people still believe third-party movements are of a lower quality. And to be honest, I have asked myself, where does this misconception come from? And I feel like part of it comes from the fact that at some point people realized ETA movements can cost just a few $100s, which led to associating these movements with cheaper quality. But that is far from the truth, because it is not like ETA movements have bigger tolerances in manufacturing, or that, for instance, ETA says it does not matter if the pinion of the wheel is plus minus 0.05, while in-house brands claim plus minus 0.0001. That's absolutely not the case, because the reason ETA movements are cheaper is mostly because they are mass-produced, millions of units in fact. And of course, this allows them to produce more cheaply, which does not make them automatically bad. So third-party movements are not of lower quality. In fact, having worked with them, I have noticed that these movements are often more reliable, stable, and easier to maintain than many in-house movements. But not only that, they cost less to maintain, and you have access to spare parts even as a non-retailer, which means you are more flexible in terms of where you can service your watch. It is also important to understand that ETA has been making movements for decades, and this has always been their primary focus, meaning they have evolved, specialized, and mastered this field. So it's not a surprise that what they do is great. But despite that, I still feel like some still assume third-party movements are less accurate than in-house movements. And no, that's not always true, because accuracy is not a question of quality. It is more about how much time is invested in regulating the movement. Now, if in-house movements often offer no real advantage in quality, exclusivity, or innovation, why do some people get upset when a stainless steel watch with a third-party movement costs 5K, yet somehow justify almost any price if the watch is equipped with an in-house movement? And I think it's because many still believe in-house movements must cost more, as they are manufactured exclusively, while some third-party movements shouldn't, because they are produced in huge amounts. And to be honest, that's not true, as the last key element I want to discuss will show. Pricing has always been a huge discussion point, especially when we see watches with a third-party movement selling for $7,000, while another watch with an in-house movement costs only $2,500. And honestly, that is a fair question. But if that's a fair question, we can do the same within the world of in-house movements. So how come an Omega equipped with a complex coaxial movement costs around $5,000, while a standard 3-hand AP watch costs more than 3 times as much? And I know some will say it's because the AP has more hand finishing, not just on the case or the dial, but also on the movement and so on. But then how do we explain that the Kudoka costs less than the AP, even though the Kudoka has not only more hand finishing but also some truly handmade parts? So you see, we could keep asking these comparison questions endlessly, and eventually nothing really makes sense, because pricing in the luxury world has never followed the universal benchmark. And it certainly doesn't depend solely on the movement, because if it did, a Patek Philippe 24 in stainless steel with a quartz movement equipped shouldn't cost as nearly as much as it does. But yet, many still believe the movement makes up most of the price, which is, as we have seen, not always the case. Because other factors play a huge role: how the case, bracelet or dial are made, additional features unrelated to the movement, and especially intangible aspects like demand, perception, and the emotions it triggers. And this is not just true for high-end watches. It also applies to entry-level and premium pieces as well. That's why some watches with third-party movements can still cost a lot. It's not primarily about the movement, but other features that add value. A good example is the Montblanc IC, which features a Gratte de Boisé dial finish, a complex technique that requires time and resources, and of course will increase the overall price of the watch. So the price of a watch is not always justified simply by whether it has an in-house movement or not. And I can tell you from my experience working for a major brand that used both, the price difference was only about 20%. And that was mainly due to the smaller number of movements produced exclusively for the brand by the supplier, and not because the movement was 20% better. Now, considering everything we discussed today, is there even a point in paying so much attention to whether a watch has an in-house movement or not? And if there is, when does a third-party movement actually make sense? As we have seen today, choosing an in-house movement often does not bring any crucial benefits. In fact, Sometimes it can even be the opposite, as some in-house movements are less stable, more difficult to maintain, and can only be serviced by official retailers or brand service centers. On top of that, brands sometimes update or replace their in-house movements with new ones, which means that in few years spare parts might become rare or servicing could cost more. So that's why in-house movements only make sense if they offer real benefits, things like longer service intervals, higher efficiency, greater stability, or unique features you simply cannot find in regular third-party movements. So if you find a watch you truly like, do not let something as ridiculous as whether it has an in-house movement or not stop you from buying it, because in many cases, third-party movements can actually be the better choice. So having said that, this is it for today, another topic that I could honestly talk about for hours, but I hope you could take something valuable away from it. And if you have any questions on this topic, drop them in the comment section down below, as I'm always happy to answer them. In the meantime, thank you for tuning in today, and as always, stay blessed and see you next time.